Hi, everybody, and welcome to this segment of Ars Lyrica's Concerts and Conversations. I'm Matthew Durst, the Artistic Director, and we're delighted to have with us today Annette Richards, Professor of Music from Cornell University, and a great friend of mine, with whom I've collaborated on numerous projects over the years, including one several years ago at Cornell that featured some music that we're going to sample on this virtual program together. The topic today, the topic for the whole week really, is music and politics, which we're interpreting fairly broadly to include music and gender politics, for example, music and the way society melds together oftentimes political figures like important patrons with important musicians. So our conversation will stay mostly in the 18th century, I think, and be centered around those areas of interest, of great interest to both myself and to Annette, including the orbit of C.P.E. Bach, in Berlin, and a few fantastic musical inventions from this era, notably the glass harmonica and Benjamin Franklin, of all people. Perhaps we should start with Ben Franklin, our one American political figure that we're including in this segment, because he was, after all, not only an important political figure, but also a gifted inventor and a fine musician, apparently. Annette, you drew my attention years ago to his work in this area and to the music that it inspired for glass harmonica, hence this program at Cornell, from which we repeated a few pieces on a subscription program here in Houston a few seasons ago. That's what we're going to be looking at on some video excerpts. Could you tell us a little bit about Ben Franklin and this weird invention of his, the glass harmonica?
Well, Matthew, I mean, thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this, one of my absolutely favorite topics. So Ben Franklin was in London, and in his incredible curiosity about basically absolutely everything, he heard one day, or he encountered somebody playing the musical glasses. So I don't know how many of you have tried making a sound come out of a wine glass, but you know how it works when you run your finger around the rim and out comes this ghostly wonderful sound. And many of you will have seen this wonderful instrument, which essentially means you have a whole bunch of different glasses with water filled to different height, and you get different pitches. And you can play pieces by doing this very complicated thing from one glass to another. And Ben Franklin thought, how about we do this a whole different way? And his brilliant invention was to essentially turn the glasses on their side, nest them one into the other, so from very large to tiny, have them put onto a spindle, which a player could make spin in the same way that you make a sewing machine work, so with a little treadle. And then with wet fingers, instead of having water in the glass, but making your fingers wet, and holding them against this essentially sort of keyboard-like glass instrument, you can make the thing sound in that way. And so he created this much more ergonomically favorable and in some sense easier to play instrument out of these glasses, and he named it harmonica. I mean, I think he was thinking, you know, it's the sort of ultimate music. It's, you know, you can hear he's thinking harmonia, harmony, as well as, you know, harmonica. So it became known as the Franklin harmonica, and we talk about it as the glass harmonica. And from there, he essentially taught a very gifted Irish English woman how to play it. And she took it on tour to Europe, first to Paris and then to the rest of Europe. And it essentially took Europe by storm. And of course, Franklin, because he had also famously invented the lightning conductor and done all these experiments with electricity, people in Europe sort of heard this, the Franklin harmonica, as a kind of weird melding of the music of the spheres with electricity, with the kind of weird sensitivities of the human body. So you got this incredibly kind of potent combination, which then becomes a vehicle for composers and performers across Europe in the late, you know, so that was in the early 1760s, and then way up into the end of the 18th century, the instrument is a thing that people knew and played and composed for.
Mm-hmm. And would you like to say a word or two about the kind of fantastic musical machines that preceded this? Because I know you've done some research into, say, Vaucanson and the automatic flute player. These were the rage in the middle of the 18th century, particularly among educated elites like Frederick the Great, who had several of them installed at Potsdam in the gardens and in his various palaces. These preceded Ben Franklin's invention of the glass harmonica, but in a sense, they are kind of related.
I think that's yes. I think that's a very, very good point. It's very much the age of invention, experimentation, and a real fascination with sort of complex machinery and mechanical operations. And it's also, of course, there's a sort of another strand going through which has to do with questions about what the human, the different, where is the soul, the human soul, and to what extent is the human being a machine? So around the 1740s and 50s, you get these very elaborate machines being made that imitate the natural world, and there are these beautiful examples. Vaucanson in Paris, who is this famous inventor who created, a mechanical flute player who could actually blow the flute. I mean, there was sort of lungs inside. It wasn't a little mini organ inside a kind of fake machine. He actually had fingers and a tongue, a strange leather tongue that actually blew the air through the flute. So it's a very famous flute player, very famous. He also created a boy who could play the drums and kind of play the flute at the same time. And famously, one of his great, this inventor's, one of his great claims to fame was his creation of a mechanical duck. And the thing about the duck, which really amazed audiences and was the kind of evidence that the line between the machine and real life was very, very fine, was that the duck could apparently eat food, corn put in front of it, digest it for a little while, and then lo and behold, it could excrete substances as a result of its digestive processes. Well, clearly it was actually a fake and the stuff was in there already. But the excitement about these machines that sort of explore the line between the human and then the kind of superhuman, or some kind of other realm, was very strong. Frederick the Great loved these instruments. They went all over Europe. People bought them, and of course we've all heard mechanical clocks, which some of those were very, very elaborately made with all sorts of moving parts as well. In France, there was also famously a harpsichord player designed essentially after Marie Antoinette, who was like a full life-size automaton who could play the harpsichord. And not only could she play the harpsichord, but she could kind of turn her eyes and her bosom would heave as she played, giving the impression that she was a fully sensing creature. So that also relates to this idea of the harmonica being this machine that could somehow manufacture sensibility and kind of, the senses of the musical being.
Right, and it certainly helped that the glass harmonica has this otherworldly sound. It sounds really quite supernatural.
Yeah.
You watch somebody play it and you can't quite fathom that sound. It's a little like an onde martineau, a manufactured electronic instrument of the 20th century. It kind of oozes sound. In fact, making chamber music with a glass harmonica player is a really interesting challenge because you can't quite ever decide where the note starts. It just kind of glides in. And trying to be really precise is difficult.
That's exactly what people loved about it. It was like, you can't, it just happens. This sound is just there. And people thought it very ghostly, very uncanny. And you're right that this is a world we're talking about of rich people. I mean, these instruments were very expensive. I mean, obviously the glass harmonica, very fragile, and the kind of thing that was displayed at courts, and both kind of out of reach of normal people and very exotic, very glamorous. And sort of, the unworldliness also was a sign of, this was not mundane music making. Right.
Since we've introduced the glass harmonica with such a lot of detail, we should probably sample a piece. This played by Dennis James, glass harmonica virtuoso from upstate New York, on a program that Ars Lyrica offered a couple of seasons ago called Sweet Philomela. The reference here is to one of the a goddess mentioned in the opening text of a cantata that we'll encounter in a few minutes' time. But this first excerpt features just the glass harmonica on its own, played by Dennis James in Mozart's famous Adagio in C major. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Annette, you probably know more about this than I do since you introduced me to him, but Dennis's instrument he made himself, yes?
No, he didn't make it himself, but he was
Okay.
very deeply involved in its being made. He
Got it.
basically did all the research, and then he worked very closely with the glass makers to make it. So he didn't technically blow the glass, but it could not have been made. I mean, he went to just glass, expert glassmakers, and then commissioned it in all its detail.
Right, and it has a very obviously 18th century kind of design aesthetic to it, complete with a foot pumping mechanism by which you make the spindle turn on which those glasses hang. And you have to wet your fingers in order to play it. That's what activates the sound coming out of the glasses. So it's quite complicated, but a beautiful instrument, and one that I will say doesn't travel all that well. When Dennis tours with it, he has to pack it very carefully in his automobile and basically drive it around the country, because putting something like that on an airplane is, well, just asking for trouble.
Absolutely. Dennis actually lent me a glass harmonica for a few years, or at least for about a year at one point, very generously. And it's a palaver, taking it apart, putting it together, and playing it, I will say, is extremely difficult. I was shocked at how hard it is to play that thing, to get the sound out of it is really tricky. So he's an amazing player, really great virtuoso.
Did you manage the Mozart on your own or not? I imagine that's a piece that everybody tries.
I got close to it, and then I was working my way through a method from the 1780s. But I never, the instrument had to go away. Dennis needed it for something else, and I've never had it back. But I'm hoping one day to get it back and go back to my weird midnight, musical music on that instrument.
All you need to do is open the windows, and the neighbors will wonder what in the world is going on in that house.
It's like having a werewolf in the neighborhood.
There was another piece on the same program that also featured the glass harmonica. This is a cantata by Johann Adolf Hasse, a composer who worked at the Dresden court for many years, but also spent a good deal of time in Austria, in Vienna. And the story of this piece is kind of complicated. It has to do, first of all, with a glass harmonica virtuoso by the name of Marianne Davies, who had a sister by the name of Cecilia. And as I remember, Marianne was a student of Franklin himself.
Or a protege of Franklin, essentially. She got the instrument from him and learned how to play it from him, yes.
Got it. And her sister was a gifted singer. They ended up doing a tour of Europe. They're English, I believe, right? They ended up doing a tour of Europe, and they got letters of introduction from people like C.P.E. Bach and others. They ended up in Vienna, staying with, as I mentioned, Johann Adolf Hasse, who composed the two of them a piece. It's a big cantata featuring a string section, a couple of horns, some flutes, a glass harmonica, and a soprano on this fantastic text that conjures Philomela, that mentions Cecilia as well, the goddess of music, and celebrates an important wedding. This is for the wedding of one of Maria Theresia, the Empress's daughters, to the Duke of Parma, as I recall, in 1769. So this fulfilled a political event, the union of two royal houses, as it were, but also used this fantastic invention of the glass harmonica in a very special way. There aren't many pieces like this. Do you know any others, Annette?
No, I don't. This is really unique, and it speaks a little bit to the excitement that people felt about the instrument itself. Because I mean, the piece is one of the extraordinary things is it's about the wedding in a very peripheral and generic way, but it's really about the glass harmonica, and it's called l'harmonica, the harmonica. And remember that one of the shticks essentially is the way the soprano voice and the sound of the harmonica have this really interesting kind of doubling effect. The idea was that Cecilia could match her voice so beautifully to the harmonica's sound that you couldn't tell which was the harmonica and which was the actual voice. So it's a really beautiful, and much of it is, there's this invocation to Philomela and how can I celebrate this august occasion with music appropriately. And then it's like, I know what I'll do. I'll have this, I can't possibly really do it, but I'll get this amazing, brilliant invention and this incredible like uber music to do it for me. Over to you, sister. And then we hear this incredible music. So it's very much about what the harmonica can and can't do. It's interesting, and you get this sense of Hasse being totally fascinated by the instrument, by these two sisters, and sort of using that as a way of celebrating this political moment.
Yeah, it's a fantastic piece. From that performance, I'd like to sample just the final aria, which takes some time. It's in multiple sections, but it features, as we said, the glass harmonica with Dennis James, and also soprano Sherazad Pantaki, singing the famous text here, the hymn to Philomela, and this wonderful evocation of this royal wedding that was taking place in Vienna in 1769. So here's the last aria, about 8 or 9 minutes, as I recall. Enjoy. That piece was written for a royal wedding. There are a lot of pieces in music history written for royal nuptials. A number of the earliest operas, for example, Orfeo, Eurydice was written for an important royal wedding. This is Jacopo Peri's Eurydice, which is kind of surprising given the way the Eurydice and Orpheus story typically ends. She remains in the underworld and he goes back to real life and doesn't really have a very good time there. In the story from Ovid, of course, he's torn apart by the Furies. That hardly ever makes it to the operatic stage. But basically, the Orpheus story does not always end happily. At least it certainly didn't in the early 17th century. And yet that was the subject for a royal wedding. I have always wondered what in the world people in Florence in 1601 thought about that. It was not necessarily a good portent for the couple.
It was realistic, Matthew. I mean,
yeah. Certainly this text that Hasse said in 1769 was a little bit more encouraging to the royal couple. Here they could delight in these wonderful allusions to mythology, the otherworldly sound of the glass harmonica, and the weird virtuoso of these two sisters who seem to become one somehow magically.
Although I have a little idea about that, actually. Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Because one of the weird things about that whole occasion was you've got these two sisters, the musicians, who are you know, the sisterliness of them is really kind of very much what it's about. But the wedding itself was bizarre because the daughter getting married was actually a replacement for her sister, who had been supposed to marry this same guy, but who died of smallpox. And in fact, there was another one before that who was also so. There's this kind of frightening in the you know, family of Maria Theresia with all her daughters. There's this frightening kind of mapping of one sister onto another, sisters dying, being kind of slotted in. And when you remember the story of Philomela itself, that too is a story, a frightening story of sisters, and one sister being, you know, silenced and grotesquely attacked by the husband of the other, Philomela herself, whose tongue is then cut out, and of course she can't speak, but then she can sing to tell a tale, and she's metamorphosed into the nightingale. So whether or not that very dark story from Ovid is somehow in the back of Hasse's mind and Metastasio, the librettist's mind, when they created this piece for the wedding of yet another daughter being essentially sacrificed for political goals by her mother. I don't know, I wonder. I mean, it's a very, you know, there are many, many layers of sisters in this particular piece. And I think there's a sort of dark echo underneath it. And those audiences, they knew their Ovid, those aristocrats. I think they would have, perhaps some of them at least, had a sense for some other, you know, point running through this whole seemingly optimistic piece.
Yeah, it was a big family, Maria Theresia's, and marked by multiple tragedies. Of course, her most famous daughter, Marie Antoinette, we know what happened to her. In fact, we're taping this on Bastille Day of all days. Weird coincidence.
Yes.
And speaking of other royal daughters and sisters, especially, that provides us with a good transition to Princess Anna Amalia of Prussia, a female musician, a terrific organist, apparently, who was a good friend of a number of people in the orbit of C.P.E. Bach, for example, at Frederick the Great's court in the middle of the 18th century. Annette, you recorded a CD several years ago on the new organ at Cornell called Music for a Princess. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that project?
Yes, that project was actually, the idea was to take music from the library of Anna Amalia. She was a very, not just a good amateur musician, obviously, but a very serious collector. And she made a remarkable library of music, both old and new. I mean, new for her time. She had one of the most complete collections of works by Handel. she had very complete collection of music by Johann Sebastian Bach. And yes, she had this extraordinary library with all sorts of music. And I thought it would be fun to have a look at her as a sort of collector and one part of that story for me was that there are many important organ works in her library. And as we know, she commissioned 2 organs. She was a very avid organ enthusiast. And in her own time, people thought, that sort of word went around by these sort of snooty, men essentially, that of course there was no way she actually really played the organ, and maybe she kind of sat down and dabbled a little bit, but she never used her feet, and I thought, I don't really think that is true. And so I went through her library and I tried to pick out some of the really magnificent pieces there and sort of create this idea that not only was she buying the music and having it copied, but she was playing it on these magnificent instruments that she had commissioned and was obviously very interested in. So that was what the project was about. And at the center of her library, of course, are a set of sonatas that were written for her for the organ that still exists by C.P.E. Bach. And so, so one of the things I was interested in doing there was actually recording some of C.P. Bach's music for her in the context of this larger music library and sort of music project that she was engaged in.
Mm-hmm. Her library is known, of course, to Bach scholars the world over because it's the repository of a number of really important things. For example, from her brother Frederick the Great, she seems to have inherited at some point the original print that was sent by Johann Sebastian Bach of the musical offering, among other things. This is a fantastic collection that she put together in the 18th century, better than really almost anybody else who comes to mind who was a music collector in terms of the importance of the sources and the centrality to the German tradition especially. Annette, do you want to tell us a little bit about the organ that you recorded these pieces on at Cornell?
Yes, this is an instrument that we built here in 2011, finished in 2011. It was a big project. And the goal was to make an instrument that was very close as possible, really, to an instrument that had been built in Berlin in 1706. So this wasn't the instrument that Anna Amalia commissioned, because her instruments were built in the 1750s and then another in the early 60s, but an instrument that she would have known as a child, which was built in the palace chapel at the Castle of Charlottenburg, which is now sort of in Greater Berlin. And the instrument that was built there was commissioned from North Germany's most famous builder, Art Schnitger, who organ enthusiasts, it's a name that they'll recognize, one of the great names of organ culture, certainly for the whole North German repertoire from the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And Art Schnitger was commissioned to build an instrument in Berlin, and it was a very unusual organ. It was very modern in many ways. It was very forward-looking. It actually seems to have been designed as much for chamber music as for church services. And this gorgeous organ, which was built for a chapel which is about the same dimensions as the chapel that we wanted to have an instrument for, was taken out. It was more or less forgotten, preserved in very much original condition until about the 1930s, rediscovered, considered a great monument to German culture, and then in the war it was packed up, taken out. Very unusually, it was taken out of its chapel in order to preserve it as this great monument, saved in the basement of another castle, and was destroyed there by bombs. But in the process of it having been removed, it was quite carefully documented, and we decided to try to use those documents to reconstruct it, and to do it using the kinds of techniques, materials, everything as close as possible to how organs were made at the beginning of the 18th century. So we did it with the research workshop at the Gothenburg Organ Art Center, GoArt, and the project was overseen by this wonderful Japanese organ builder, Munetaka Yokota, and we ended up with a spectacular organ, which actually doesn't look like the organ that Anna Amalia would have known as a girl, because we used a different case for it. We actually laid it out in a different way because the original instrument had many compromises were made by Ars Lyrica because the architect for the chapel had forgotten to leave room for an organ. So he'd had to kind of shove it into the back of a gallery. And we thought, we won't shove it into the back of a gallery. We'll use another case that Ars Lyrica designed around the same time and put it in that. So what we made, it was what I think of as a fantasy reconstruction of that Berlin organ. And because it has this late 17th century style in some ways, and also a kind of, much more sort of sweeter 18th century style, it seemed like the right instrument for the music from this library, which looks in both directions, forward and back. So
yeah, absolutely. The times that I've heard it, I've been really impressed with its versatility. I mean, it's very much historically minded and gorgeous to look at and listen to. And it plays really everything from mid-17th all the way through mid-18th century repertoire with great authority, really convincing sounds, incisive articulation, lots of color. It's a gorgeous instrument. Yeah.
And you know what? You can play Brahms on it. I've played Brahms. I've played Mendelssohn. I've played. You can play 20th century music on it too. Funnily enough. So, but yes, for that music, it's just spectacular and really exciting to play. Yeah.
So the excerpts that we're going to share with people are a CPE Bach sonata and a fugue by Anna Amalia herself. Do you want to say, would you like to say a few words about the fugue especially?
Yes. I mean, the fugue is interesting. So Anna Amalia appointed 2 honorary Kapellmeisters. One of them was Kernberger, who was a J.S. Bach student and disciple, and the other was CPE Bach himself. And from Kernberger was very much her teacher, and Kernberger obviously taught her counterpoint. I think it was a bit old-fashioned, her music education, but he taught her counterpoint. And there's some music survives from those studies, and this is a small duet. It's a kind of 2-voice fugue, originally scored for, I want to say, violin and viola, possibly two violins. Can't remember, but at least in the manuscript, it's 2 string instruments, I think 2 violas. And, but it's clearly the kind of music that is kind of cerebral in some ways and can be played on any kinds of instruments. And so I made a little arrangement for the organ so that we could hear Anna Amalia's own musical voice as part of this project.
Nice. How much of her music survives? Are there more than just a few pieces?
No, there's really just a handful of things. Yeah, there's not very much.
Is there much from Wilhelmina, her sister?
Do you know, I don't know. I don't know about that, actually.
She was a gifted musician as well, of course.
Yes.
And though she left the Berlin Operette fairly early after she got married and moved to Bayreuth, the palace there at Bayreuth is gorgeous. Yes. Highly recommended that place as well. And she pursued music, as I recall, for the rest of her life. I just don't know whether she ever turned to composition.
As did Frederick the Great too. I mean, their brother, from whom there is music that survives.
Yes, quite a lot actually.
Yeah, I mean, they were all very mean about Anna Amalia. They totally laughed about her and her organ playing, and there are letters saying, I mean, it was awful. They called her fatty. They said, la dicke. And I mean, it's terribly mean. And they're like, oh, Anna Amalia, she's all obsessed with her organ and she won't stop playing the organ, and off she goes playing her organ again. They obviously thought, I guess, that the organ wasn't appropriate for a princess. But she showed them.
Yeah, it's funny how adolescents and even young adults who end up as organists sometimes do regard the instrument as a great refuge from familial criticism, hostile peers, that sort of thing. Because of course, when you're playing the organ, you're shut up in a church somewhere and no one bothers you.
Yeah. Or you're hidden. And actually, this is what's so sweet in her letters, because her organ, of course, was in a big space in her palace. But she describes when it's first sort of inaugurated, and she goes over to play it, and she says, everybody can hear me playing. And she said, even the boys out in the streets stop, and I'm clearly kind of giving them a show. And you can tell she's ambivalent about it. On some level, it's very much her thing that she's doing for herself. But at the same time, being overheard in this way is, there's a kind of thrill to it. It's very interesting. It's both secret and public at the same time.
Yeah, overheard but not seen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Private. Yeah.
Interesting distinction to make.
Yes.
about that. And the CP Bach Sonata, if you'd like to mention just basic parameters of these pieces.
Yes, well, they're in 3 movements generally, and this one is 2, fast, slow, fast. There's no independent pedal part for them, which I think is one of the reasons people thought, oh, she couldn't play with her feet. They are interesting in that we know they were written for Anna Amalia's organ because the compass is too big for most organs. They go up to high F, when most organs of the period only go up to high C or D maybe. And her organ had this extended compass. And these 4 sonatas that C.P. Bach writes in his catalogue, that they're organ sonatas, they could really only be played on her organ, which is sort of interesting as well. So they're quite beautiful pieces. And this one in G minor is quite, tumultuous as well. There's a sort of tempestuous aspect to it. It's not kind of easy, charming music, really. There's quite a powerful core to it, I think, and that runs through all of these sonatas in very interesting ways. It's very good music.
Excellent. Thanks for that little synopsis. They're wonderful pieces. I've always enjoyed playing them myself, and I know you do too. thanks for joining us today for this episode of Concert and Conversations. Thanks especially to Annette Richards for sharing with us her expertise and her wonderful playing. And we will see you again for the 50th episode in Ars Lyrica's virtual segments in 2 weeks' time. Thanks.